Bonjour à tous. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session about VS Code and ABL. So what we are going to do during this session is to have a look at what can be done with VS Code when working in an ABL environment. So yeah, first a quick slide about the Stack Overflow developer survey from 2021, 2022, and 2023, asking developers what was their the IDE that they were using on a daily basis. So which ones they were using, whatever the language, whatever the profile of the developer. So we can see that VS Code was the most common answer. Yeah, here with 71% in 2021, 74% 2022, 74% again in 2023. And we still have exactly the same percentage in 2024. So VS Code, that means that VS Code is extremely widely used as an IDE, much more than any other IDE. The second one being Visual Studio, which is only limited to a few Microsoft languages, IntelliJ IDE, which is only for Java. So the percentages are much lower. And the reason why VS Code is so high, this is because it's possible to support a lot of languages in this IDE. So you can work with extensions. So VS Code is an extensible platform as an IDE. So this means that you can write an extension in order to support almost any language in the world. So if you go to the marketplace, there is a marketplace with free extensions, paid extensions. You can search for any language, and this is a screenshot of the marketplace searching for programming languages, and there are more than 5,000 results. So this means more than 5,000 extensions in order to support languages. So this goes from Python support, for example, for Jupyter notebooks, for C, C++, Python again, ESLint, C#, and you will see that you have support for a lot of languages, going from the most widely known ones, going to the most obscure ones. And ABL can be considered an obscure language that almost nobody knows outside of this room. If you ask any developer, they probably won't know anything about ABL. So how is that possible? How is it possible to have more than 5,000 languages for platforms that was started only a couple years ago? The platform was started in 2013 as a prototype, and the first release was in 2015. So in only 9 years, we already have 5,000 languages being supported. So the reason why it's possible to have so many languages, it is because Microsoft introduced the concept of a language server protocol. So the idea is, instead of having to write a plugin for every language on every IDE, you just have to implement any executable that implements a specific protocol. So this means that you don't have to write JavaScript support on VS Code, and then on Atom, and then on VI, and then on Eclipse. You just only write a single process. It's just a simple command line that you have to execute, and then you implement entry points, such as completion, diagnostics, hover, formatting. So every IDE, technically they all do the same. You have minor differences, but you just open a document, do some modification, you expect the IDE to compile. If you type control space, you expect the IDE to provide some code completion results, and then you expect to execute some code, and so on. So whatever the IDE, you do more or less the same. So all those entry points are specified in the language server protocol. You implement them, and then it will be possible to use that in VS Code, but also anywhere else. Because we are those days talking about VS Code. Microsoft is pushing updates every month on VS Code, but they could decide in 1 year, in 2 years, that they turn VSCode into a proprietary product or a paid product, and then nobody will want to use VSCode anymore. So it will be possible to switch to any other IDE implementing the same language server protocol, and you will be able to work in exactly the same way for all the entry points. So you will have exactly the same results for the code completion as before. It will be a different tool, but the language server will be exactly the same. So language support will be absolutely identical. So we don't know what will happen in 10 years. Maybe VSCode will still be there, maybe it will be a different one, but the language server will still be present and still be implemented. So it's one ring to bind them all. So just have a very single interface for the specification of the protocol, and then you can use it anywhere. So this is a sample of the protocol. So here are the development tools. The user opens a document, so you just open your .cls, your .p, then a message, a notification is sent from the IDE to the language server. Says text document did open, and this is a document that I just opened. This is a text, this is the URI, so do whatever you want. So maybe you can start by compiling in the background this procedure in order to check the syntax, for example, in order to make sure that our code is available. Language server can do whatever it wants. Then here, the user start modifying the document. So every time you type a key, text document did change is sent from the client to the language server. So every time you receive a new key, you receive the new text. You can recompute everything. You can recompute the outline view. For example, if you change the procedure name or function name, you have to update the outline view. So you can do that in the background as quickly as the user types in some keys. Here, when typing things, the IDE should be able to provide some diagnostics. For example, your code doesn't compile. You want to get the information that the code doesn't compile as quickly as possible. You also want to know that you started defining a new variable. It's not used anywhere. So you should get a warning about, oh, you defined a variable. You don't do anything with that. You should remove it or do something with a variable. So get meaningful information from the language server, and then it is up to the code editor to display that according to the IDE. So another thing, the user execute go-to-definition, so you have a variable defined as a progress.json.something. You type F12 on VSCode. That could be any different shortcut on a different code editor. Then a request is sent. Text document definition. Here is a position where the user typed some F12. Give me the symbol at this location. Then you receive the response, and then the IDE will decide, probably opening a new document, showing it in the user interface, and then more and more requests will be sent. So this is the entire process that is repeated over time. So in VS Code, it's possible to have multiple language servers being started at the same time. So you can have a project which is a mix of Java and OpenEdge, for example. So you will have one process which is started for Java, one process which is started for ABL, and communication is handled by VS Code. So technically, VS Code starts a process, and communication is done over standard input and standard output. So when you open an ABL file, communication will be done over the OpenEdge language server and to the Java language server and so on. So you can have as many languages in a single IDE. So what is the status for ABL? So this presentation was first delivered at the Poet Summit in 2021. That was the COVID conference, so not so many people attended this session. But the smiley, the emoji, was a bit different at this time. So it was a crying emoji because the language server was only available as a prototype. Nothing was publicly available. The first version of the plugin plugin was released in 2022, beginning of 2022 approximately. With initial support, it was a bit more than a prototype. It was not exactly stable, but it started doing things. So we are now in 2024. The language server is much more stable. I wouldn't say the situation is perfect, but it's getting better and better over time. This means that it's possible to compile code directly in VSCode, it's possible to have code completion, it's possible to have the outline view, and so on. We will have a quick demo for just a bit later. So just a quick description of the plugin. It's an opinionated project description which is required to set up a project. So do not expect VSCode to be a replacement for the procedure editor. It's not a way to quickly open any .p and execute it, then connect your local databases and execute your code. This is not meant to do that. This is a project-based IDE. So this means that it has to be configured for your environment. Usually you can configure the project and store the configuration file in your Git repository. This is the expectation. So you open VS Code on a given project and then everything is pre-configured. So the ProPath, database connection, and so on. This is more or less the same as in as with Developer Studio, which is also a project-based IDE. It's a code editor only. This is meant to edit code. This is not meant to modify your windows. There is no visual designer, there is no app builder, nothing. This is meant to edit code, and there are no plans to implement a visual designer in VS Code. No plans doesn't mean it will never be done, but currently this is not on the roadmap. So this means that if your project is based on .NET GUI, VS Code might not be the best thing to use. So Developer Studio still has a visual designer that will probably never be backported to VS Code. If you still have legacy Windows working with the app builder, there is a shortcut that you can use in order to open any .w. This opens the app builder with the correct database connection, the correct ProPath, so that you can move your widgets around, save the file, and get back to VS Code in order to edit the code. But yeah, it's not a GUI editor, not integrated in VS Code. Something which is extremely interesting, it's independent from the OpenEdge version. So currently, VS Code and the language server is tested with 11.7, 12.2, 12.8. It's not tested with 10.2e. Technically, I don't think it will work, but it could be possible to make that work. The idea is to make sure that you can upgrade to the latest versions of the development tools while staying on older versions. So the rhythm of the development tool upgrade doesn't have to match the upgrade rhythm of the OpenEdge upgrade. So you can still work with 12.2 for some time, but you always want to use the latest version of the development tool. You want to use the latest functionalities, the latest bug fix, and you don't have to wait for a new patch coming from OpenEdge. So technically, you just configure your project to use one of the OpenEdge versions. You just need to specify the path to the OpenEdge install directory, and then you will use that in your project. So currently, 11.7, 12.2, 12.8. So it's also a plugin which does a few things, but it relies on, as much as possible, on the VS Code for standard tasks. So in VS Code, you have extensions for lots of things. For example, there is no way to manage your PASO instances from VS Code, the same way you can do in Developer Studio, where you can configure a new PASO instance in Developer Studio. This is not included in the VS Code plugin. However, it could be possible to work on that using other extensions. It's possible to have a communication between extensions, and so we just make available the configuration of the project so that any other extension can query the VS Code extension and say, say, oh, you are currently on this file, please give me the configuration, please give me the location, the information about the outline, and so on. So this, you can query that from other extensions, so it will be possible in your own environment to write custom extensions to say, oh, I would like to manage my PASO instances, or I would like to add some extra behavior, I would like to do something on top of the compilation process. There are ways to extend that. So we will keep the core extension as small as possible and as focused on the few specific tasks so that it doesn't get too large and too big to maintain. This also means that if we keep it small, we will be able to release versions much faster and provide bug fixes much faster. So currently we will have a quick demo after that, but we can have an outline view, code completion, hover, symbols, syntax highlight, code analysis. I would say more or less what any developer expects from an IDE. It's not fully complete. There is no full support for everything, but it will be expanded over time. There is also an integrated AVM debugger, also a PASOE debugger, so you can connect to any running AVM, to any running PASOE instance, even remote ones, and debug directly from VSCode. One note, the plugin PCT is open source. My company here also provides Cable, which is a Sonar Cube analyzer, which is partly open source, partly commercial. This plugin is partly open source. The core plugin will stay free. There might be paid extensions in the future, but the core plugin will stay free. So if you want to start working with VS Code, you can consider that the core plugin will stay free. I will not hide that some extension might be paid in the future. We'll just have a quick demo. Give me, hopefully there won't be any demo effect where everything is fading. So, can you see the screen on the TVs? Yeah. So here is VS Code. So I'm just connected to a remote Amazon EC2 instance with a few sample files. This is a sample project which is pre-configured. So first we will have a quick look at the project. It's not large enough, probably. Is that better? Is that large enough? Good. Okay, so this is the main project description, and this is probably the tricky part if you want to set up your project. So there was a workshop yesterday afternoon in order to configure, in order to learn how to use VS Code. I think 2/3 of the attendees already tried the VS Code plugin, but were not successful setting up the configuration file. So maybe this is not explanations on the GitHub project are not good enough, or maybe I don't know exactly, but maybe it's too difficult, I don't know. But this is a tricky part, so you have to read the instructions carefully. The instructions can be found directly on the extension page, so if you have a look here, this is the extension, and here directly on this page you have a list of what you have to configure in your environment to make the project work. So everything is explained, but as I've said, maybe not in a good enough way. But this configuration file, usually you do that once, and then you push that to the code repository and you never touch it again. So we will just have a look at the various sections. Oh, it's okay. So every project has a name and version. So currently, this is not super interesting, but that will be interesting in the future. That will be meant to handle dependencies so that it will be possible to have a project rely on other project and say, I depend on this module number 1, version 1.0.1, and that will be automatically injected in the ProPass. So if this is currently opened as a project, source code will be injected automatically, otherwise it will be the ProPass. The PL files that will be injected, fetched from an artifact repository and then injected in the ProPass. But currently that is not available, that will come later. Then the character set OpenEdge version. So here you just specify the version number, and on your machine that you are working on, you will just have to specify that 12.8 is installed at this location. This means that you will be able to use the same configuration file on Linux and Windows, for example, because the installation directory is specific to your machine. So it will be a different configuration on Linux and Windows. You just specify the version. Graphical mode is that's coming from PCT. That's if you want to use _progress or prowin to execute and the AVM and compile your code. You can add any extra parameters to your session. See if you rely on specific AVM options to compile your code or to execute something. You can add whatever you want. Then the tricky section is the build path. So this is where you define your source directories and your ProPass entries. So usually you will have at least one source directory. So here we have 2 source directories. So source/procedures and classes, which are in a separate directory, and they are of type source. Source entry means that the directory will be constantly monitored for changes. If you change a file in VSCode or outside of VSCode, then that will be automatically recompiled on the... What happened? Okay. So source directories are monitored, and then every time you modify a file, that will be monitored, and if you modify your file within VSCode or outside of VSCode, then it will be recompiled immediately. That means that if you switch to a different Git branch, for example, you git checkout, maintenance, or another version, that will automatically change and recompile what has been modified in this specific branch. So you don't have to do any manual step to recompile everything. This is handled for you automatically. So here we have then ProPass entries. This is added to the ProPass of the AVM, which is handling the compilation. However, we don't monitor changes on source code. So if you have a directory which contains .p, that will not be monitored. That will monitor our code changes. So if this is managed in a different project that compiles on the fly, it will detect that our code has been modified, and then it will read the new method signatures, for example, from there. But it doesn't monitor changes from source code, from .p, .w, .cls. So usually you will have a few entries. Just remember, that depends on your project, but just remember that the larger the ProPass, the slower will be your compilation process. Also, if you want to keep things as fast as possible, you should have everything locally. Remember that Git behaves correctly with Git. VS Code behaves correctly with Git. Any other source code repository is by default not correctly handled, and so Git assumes that everything is done locally. So your source directories should be local. Even your dependencies should be on your local drives. That will be the fastest way to compile your code. You can put network drives that will just slow down things. And the higher the number of entries, the slower your compilation process will be. But it's up to your project configuration anyway. Then a build directory. This is where all the R code will be generated. You can override that directly in the build path for source type. Then the number of threads. This is a number of AVM that will be started when we execute VSCode. This is done in a way that you can compile multiple .p in parallel. So if you have quite large environment with a couple thousand files, for example, it's extremely useful to have multiple threads compiling your code. You can choose that. Depends on the size of the power of your machine, how many cores you have on your machine, and this can be overridden per machine as a user setting. So here it's only one thread. Remember, if you already have a build process using PCT, you can already specify the number of threads. I'm sure some of you already ran into issues when compiling multiple classes in parallel, and then suddenly you have a crash of the AVM, just because two sessions are trying to compile different classes but the same parent or the same hierarchy. And then there can be a conflict when reading files or writing files, and this can crash the AVM. No change in here. It can happen if you check out a very large project which is not compiled in your current directory, you open it in VS Code, it will try to compile everything in multiple threads. You may have session crashes. That doesn't change. That's something to be improved, but something has to be done with progress to make that work correctly. Here, database connection, you can define as many database connections as you want. Here, the connection is done with a local read-only connection, which is the fastest way to compile any OpenEdge code. If you compile against a network database, things will be much slower. The idea is to make sure that you can generate your database locally out of a DF file. It's anyway always a good idea to have the DF file stored in your code repository. So here you also have to specify the schema file, which is used by the language server to extract the various symbols in order to know that customer, for example, is a table in this context. So as a piece of advice, always store your DF file in the code repository. You have to keep track of the changes applied to your database schema and recreate the databases on the fly based on this schema, and then use a local read-only connection for local compilation. So, using a read-only connection means that you can start multiple threads in parallel without having to rely on a database broker. So you don't have anything to do. You don't have to execute a batch file to start your set of databases. Everything is done. You open VS Code, everything's ready. And by managing correctly the schema, the DF file, you can make sure that the R code will be generated using the right CRC, because this is an empty database. Even that's a Sports 2000, so it contains some data. But when you load a DF file in an empty database, you don't have any data. So this is meaningless in order to test your application. So technically, you have a local database for compilation, and then you will execute against a database on the network or even locally, but with some data. And you have to make sure that you don't have inconsistent CRC between this database and the execution databases. So make sure you manage your schema as part of your code repository. Here we can have extra profiles. This is a way to start VS Code with some different parameters or with a different OpenEdge version. So technically you can define as many profiles as you want, and you can switch from one profile to the other one. So in each section you will be able to override different values. So you can say we inherit from the default profile, and we just modify the value of graphical mode. So everything else will be identical. We just use ProWin in order to compile the code. You can define as many profiles as you want. Usually you can use that to have various database connection, various versions of your databases, or different OpenEdge version. There are multiple ways to use the profiles. So here, this is the tricky part to set up. I think the biggest trap is probably the schema file attributes. I got multiple reports that outline view was not working as expected. That was just because the schema file attribute was not set. And as I've said, the language server is written in Java, so all the symbols are extracted from a Java process. So we do not connect to the database. So we have to know the list of tables in order to extract symbols and to know that customer is a table and customer.name is a field of type integer or character. So if you don't provide the schema file, then many things will just fail, okay? So make sure that this is done correctly. So here, this is the .p. If we get there, we have access to the outline view. So we have C1, C2, we have the list of variables. If we click here, that goes directly here to the variable. Here, if we type define, we have some code completion. Here, it knows that, oops. It provides the options that are available for the statement that we are typing. XYZ as int 64, okay, here we save. So if we introduce any compilation error, so when we save, we have those red line saying that there is a compilation issue at this line number. So what you expect from any IDE. So here we can also have the compilation, the compiler warnings that are reported here. So here we know that this is an expression statement that evaluates to a constant. We also have information about code analysis. So if your project is bound to a SonarQube instance, you will directly execute the rules locally. So you can pre-configure your project, specify the rules that you want to execute locally, and every time you save, you will get the feedback that something is bad. So here we have the information that variable C2, this is assigned in the process but never read. So here, yes, it is assigned here. If we do that in comment, here we now have a warning saying that this variable is unused. So technically here we can just get rid of this variable in order to have one less warning, less noise in the code, and so on. So this session is not about SonarQube and the lint rules, but if you want, you can have a look at our website. You will find information on this topic. So here, let's go back to there. If I go here, I can open some extra files. Here, simple one. We have code completion for the various methods. So we have the method signatures. We have access to the properties. So everything is read from the R code. So we get some pretty decent code completion, which works for OpenEdge objects, but also from .NET classes. So even though there is no support for the .NET Visual Designer, you can still have code accessing .NET or .NET Core using 12.8. So you just have to generate some symbols. So there is an action, and this is explained in the documentation, but using you can generate the assembly catalog that will generate a temporary file in order to extract all the objects, all the classes and methods available from your assembly.xml, and then that will be available as part of the code completion. So here you can navigate into the include files, for example. So anything you have. Control P is a magic shortcut in VS Code to open any file. So this is probably the first one that you have to learn. Control P, then you start typing something. So the file name, and then you have it. Control-Shift-P is the second keyboard shortcut that you have to learn. This is in order to execute actions. So if you want to do something in VS Code, then use Control-Shift-P, type a few characters from the actions that you want to execute, and you will probably find it in the list. Just one thing about one question that was asked yesterday during the workshop about the casing of the source code. How many people are working with uppercase? Lowercase? Yeah, a bit more. So people are switching to more and more to lowercase. So here, something which is very interesting that has been done with Mike Fechner, who is fond of uppercase, or who was fond of uppercase. So he wanted to be able to have his code, source code in uppercase. So he wanted to have something to say, if I type define space, have it uppercase automatically. That will never ever be available from VS Code. The only reason is I just hate that, so I don't want to implement it. The second thing is that it's possible to switch. I understand that some people prefer working with lowercase, some people work with uppercase. It's a matter of taste. So here, there is an action to convert to lowercase. So here, you check out your source code, you convert it to lowercase, you can even assign a keyboard binding to this action. Then you have your source code, you work in lowercase, you read everything lowercase, it's perfect. Then you add your modification, and before committing to the repository, because your boss wants everything in uppercase, you switch back to uppercase, and then your boss is happy, you are happy. It's good enough to know not to convert method names, and even if, for example, the add method will never be converted for objects, that will be done for functions, but not for method. So it's good enough. You just need to have all the objects available in your ProPath. So here, just another example of what you can do. You can execute code. This is something that everybody do. There is no way to directly execute code using F2 or using the run button in Developer Studio. And that will never be implemented in the VS Code extension. So what you do, the way you start your application in VS Code is by using tasks. So tasks is a standard in VS Code to execute any process in the context of your project. So here we just define one or more tasks in our project that can be stored in the Git repository. So you can share that with all the developers. They have access to the same set of tasks, and then you execute them. So you just define what is a process that you want to execute. So here on Windows, that will be prowin.exe, and then all the variables, the arguments of the process. So you have a quite long list of processes, but I don't think it's worth implementing the box that you have in Developer Studio, where you have a checkbox or fill-in for every single option available in the AVM. So here, it's free for all. You just decide exactly the various options that you want to execute in your process. And to my mind, it's impossible to have something working for everybody. So this way, you just do whatever you want. So in order to execute your application, you type Ctrl-Shift-P in order to have an action, then run task. And here, for example, the GUI debugger. So this GUI debugger will start here, the application connected to the database, and on top of that, we start with -debug ready 3099. So the session, the AVM, will just stop at startup and wait for a debugger to attach to this process. Then here we can go to the run and debug section and say, I would like to attach to an AVM. So this is extremely easy to configure. We just click on run, and then the debug console is open here. I'm sure you recognize this message. So we now have the VS Code debugger, which is attached to the remote session. So here the session is local. It's running on the same machine, but technically this can be on a remote machine. That will work exactly in the same way. So here we click on OK. And then we have a debugger here. So we have access to the list of variables, we have the list of parameters, the list of buffers, we have the call stack. If we type F10, we will go onto the next step. So here, if we go I2 is now 1 billion or something like that. We have values with test Unicode, which is incorrect because I overwrote a few things. Here we have access to the buffers. So TT1, if we assign the field value, then this is available from here. We can watch some expressions. We have access to the dataset, to the system handles. Here, this is this is invalid in this context. So here we get there. We can go into the sub-procedures. We get here. Run internal procedure. Here we can go into include files. I have a... Okay, then we enter include files. So anything you would expect from a debugger is available in this version. So there might be, I've seen a few bug reports using the PASOE debugger, but the AVM debugger is working more or less correctly. Anyway, I would be happy to receive any bug report on the debugger. There might be cases where there is still a failure. So here we continue this way, and then we can set breakpoints too, and so on. So here, this is a debugger. Another point which is extremely interesting with VSCode is that it's possible to work with SSH to have a local session run attached to a remote environment. So here what I'm going to do is I will close this VSCode instance, and I will just leave the EC2 instance and go back to my MacBook. So here I just start VSCode locally. I am on my MacBook, and I just connect to a remote session. So this is SSH. The only thing that you need is an open SSH server running on Windows or directly on Linux. It's easier to install on Linux. It's there by default, but now it's much easier to configure that on Linux. I forgot, I just didn't start the service. Let me start it. Okay, and then I will reconnect to the remote session, and here it is. So here the language server is being started on the remote side. We can see we have references to see something, so we know that we are on Windows currently. It's control. Yes. So if I do debugger 01.p, I just see exactly the same code as before. So this is running on my Mac, just VS Code. The language server, the AVM session, everything else, this is running on the remote Windows machine. So you do the development, this is compiled on Windows, while I'm working on a Mac. The R code will be generated locally, so then you can execute your application with a network ProPath, for example. That will be, everything will be available. That will be recompiled on the fly. So you don't need to have OpenEdge installed on your local machine. You can just use remote development machine. That's extremely useful, for example, if you want to work with application servers or TTY application and you don't want to use VI. Then you start VI and you never know how to exit VI. So you can use VS Code, Control W or Command W, and you close your editor. So you can even use the debugger. It works too. I've seen one issue, but here we can start the debugger in TTY mode. We have exactly the same message. We attach to the AVM. Message is here. We go back. Presentation is not perfect, but here we can step into the code, and it just works. I've seen an issue with variables, so maybe coming from the connection to on this network, I'm unsure. But technically here, I'm using the debugger on my MacBook connected to a remote instance. That's useful. I think many people ask progress for macOS development environment. This is now available, or more or less. You can't execute code on macOS, but it's as if you were working on macOS. Another extremely interesting feature when in VS Code is that you can use development containers. So you can use containers in general to compile your code and execute the language server or have local databases. So development containers, this is supported by default in VS Code, and it's just a way to specify that your project, instead of relying on software installed on your local machine, that will rely on Docker images to execute some code. So if you, this way, you can create Docker images or images, it doesn't have to be Docker. You can create images for the OpenEdge installation, for example, or use the images provided by Progress. Then you can create another image for a set of databases for your environment. So images that are refreshed every week, for example, using live data, some anonymized live data, or a subset of the full databases on your environment. So this means that locally you will have access to a set of databases with meaningful data and up-to-date data that can be refreshed almost instantly. You just execute a Docker pull or any Podman pull or whatever the software you are working with. You pull the image and you have a new set of databases. Then you can also have a PASOE Docker image, which is pre-configured to connect to your databases, and where you specify that I'm using those transports, I'm using /APSV and a few web handlers. This is pre-configured in the image, so only one person has to do the configuration, then this is shared among the entire set of developers. So technically, you start VS Code, it will automatically pull the images from the repository and start everything. You don't have to install anything locally. In order to onboard new developers, that's extremely powerful. And it's, to my mind, a very good thing to have a look at if you are in a PASOE dev environment. I would not recommend that if you have a legacy GUI application, that this is not the right context. But if you have PASOE services that are shared, available in PASOE, definitely you should have a look at that. It's extremely, extremely useful. Okay, so, oh yeah, I'm losing the connection. It's probably, there is no, it's on the battery. This is more or less what I wanted to show during this presentation. Any question at this stage? Who is already using VS Code for ABL? Okay. Any question? Yes?
You said that the extension is open source.
Extension is
open source and published, and there is a version.
So question is about the open source status of the extension. So there are two parts in the extension. The first one is a TypeScript part, which is what you see here in VS Code. So this part is open source. This is the syntax highlight, for example. This is the open source. This is the way you can execute actions in VS Code. This is open source. Then you have the language server, which is bundled with the extension. This is a Java thing. This part is not open source. And it relies on the parser. So many components of the language server are common with ProParse, the SonarQube analyzer, with PCT, and, but yeah, it's not open source, unfortunately. So you can modify, you can open pull request on the VSCode extension. For example, Peter Judge provides many changes on the syntax highlight, and it's possible to extend the extension to modify an open pull request. It's a standard GitHub project. So yeah, not everything is open source, but it's free. Regarding the license, you need to bring your own ABL license in order to use the language server. So it doesn't come with any license. You still have to pay your OpenEdge licenses. Another question? No? So we can then go to lunch. Thank you.